Pit Stop, a true horror story. Introduction. Chris, a seasoned long-haul truck driver, had been on the road for nearly 14 hours straight. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt had become a lullaby, keeping him in a state of half-consciousness. The radio had stopped working hours ago, and the highway seemed endless. With every mile he drove, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the road ahead, and the world outside his truck turned into a void. The headlights barely pierced the mist. He rubbed his eyes, fighting exhaustion. A flicker of light through the haze caught his attention. A small, run-down gas station, the kind that most truckers avoid unless they're desperate. Chris was running low on fuel and needed rest. His GPS showed that the next rest area was miles away. With no other option, he took the exit, his tires crunching over gravel as he pulled up to the station. The gas station's neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow across the lot. A faded, "Open 24 hours" sign hung crookedly above the door, as if it had been there for decades. Chris didn't think much of it at first. He'd stopped at places like this before, but something about the station felt off. The quietness unnerved him. There were no other vehicles around, no signs of life beyond the flickering light. The pit stop. The arrival. Chris climbed out of the cab and stretched his stiff legs. The cold air hit him like a wall, sharp and biting. As he walked toward the station, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel seemed louder than usual, the quiet almost suffocating. The only light came from the flickering neon sign and the dim yellow glow of a single street lamp by the gas pumps. The attendant, an older man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, stood behind the counter, peering at Chris through the glass with an unsettling gaze. He wore a faded uniform, his name tag missing. The man smiled, but it was more of a grimace than a greeting. "Evening," the man said in a low, raspy voice. "Fuel?" Chris nodded, trying to shake off the chill that had settled in his bones. "Yeah, just a fill-up," he muttered, keeping his distance. "Anything else?" "The diner's open," the attendant offered, his voice barely audible. Chris hesitated. He didn't feel like dealing with people, but hunger gnawed at him, and the long stretch of highway had left him drained. He nodded again and headed toward the diner at the side of the station, the door creaking open as he stepped inside. The diner felt like it had been frozen in time, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and grease. The faded vinyl booths were cracked, and the red and white checkered floor tiles were chipped. A single overhead light buzzed faintly, and an old jukebox in the corner played a melancholy jazz tune, its static crackling. Despite the coldness outside, the diner felt stifling, the air thick with something Chris couldn't quite place. A waitress appeared from the kitchen, her face pale with a painted-on smile. She had the kind of look that unsettled Chris, almost too perfect, like a doll with wide, vacant eyes. Her name tag read Evelyn, but it didn't seem to matter. "Coffee?" she asked, setting a menu down in front of him. "Yeah. Black," Chris said, his voice hoarse. "And, a slice of pie, if you've got it?" Evelyn nodded and turned away without another word, her movements stiff and mechanical. Chris glanced around the diner, his eyes scanning the walls. He noticed the photographs hanging in yellowed frames. Families, couples, groups of smiling strangers posing outside the gas station. He squinted at one of the pictures, a young couple standing next to an old truck. Their faces were frozen in time, but there was something in their eyes that unsettled him. He looked closer, but the faces seemed to blur, as if the photo had been altered. The edges of the image were frayed. The colors faded to a sickly sepia tone. A sense of unease crept up his spine. The warning Evelyn returned with his coffee and pie. The coffee was bitter, burnt, and the pie, well, it tasted off. The crust was too hard, the filling too thick and unnaturally sweet. But hunger pushed him to eat anyway. A creak from the back of the diner broke his focus. He looked up to see an old man hunched in a corner booth. His clothes were ragged, his hair a wild mess of gray. He motioned for Chris to come closer, his finger shaking slightly. Chris hesitated, but eventually stood and made his way over. The man's bloodshot eyes were fixed on him with a look of wild desperation. "You shouldn't stay here," the man whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "This place, it's cursed. It takes people who linger too long." Chris frowned, thinking the man was just a drunk or a local eccentric. "What are you talking about?" he asked, glancing nervously toward the kitchen, where Evelyn had reappeared, standing motionless. "They feed you. They give you drinks, and you think you're just tired. But you're not. You're trapped," the man hissed. "Everyone who's ever stopped here, they're all gone. They took 'em." Before Chris could respond, the man's head snapped around to the door. Evelyn had appeared in the doorway, her smile now even wider. The man's face turned pale and he mumbled something inaudible, his hands shaking. "Leave, son," the man croaked, and in a swift motion he stood and shuffled toward the back door, his movements jerky. Chris stared after him, then glanced at Evelyn, who was now watching him with a strange intensity. He felt a surge of dread that he couldn't explain. "Maybe I'll just get some air," Chris muttered, his voice barely audible. He grabbed his jacket and made his way toward the exit, the chill of the air outside feeling suddenly refreshing. The discovery. Outside, the cold air stung his face, and he sucked in a deep breath. He decided to check on his truck, but as he walked toward it, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. Suddenly, he heard a muffled noise coming from behind the station. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was screaming. Chris froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. Without thinking, he grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the sound, his boots crunching in the gravel. The screaming grew louder as he approached a small, dilapidated shed behind the station. The door creaked open, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Inside the shed, there were piles of personal belongings: watches, wallets, rings, clothing. But most unsettling of all were the photographs pinned to the walls. More pictures of travelers, but these ones were distorted, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for help. In the center of the shed, the floor was stained with fresh blood, dark and sticky. There were smudged handprints on the walls, and strange symbols scrawled in what appeared to be red chalk. A low, raspy laugh echoed behind him. Chris spun around, his flashlight catching the outline of Evelyn, standing in the doorway of the shed. "You shouldn't have looked," she said softly, her voice almost loving. The chase fear surged through Chris like a bolt of electricity. He bolted from the shed, not daring to look back. The night air felt suffocating as he ran toward his truck, heart pounding in his chest. The shadows seemed to shift, taking on human shapes. Suddenly, figures emerged from the trees, shadowy, twisted shapes that moved with unnatural speed. Their faces were gaunt and hollow, their eyes black as coal, and their bodies contorted in grotesque ways. They were the people from the photographs, but now they were something else. Something twisted, something hungry. Chris reached his truck, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the door handle. He jumped inside, slamming the door shut, just as one of the figures reached out to grab him. With trembling hands, he started the truck, the engine roaring to life. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and the truck lurched forward, speeding down the road as the figures chased him into the night. The fog lifted gradually, and the figures faded into the mist, their shapes dissolving like smoke. When Chris finally found a safe place, a truck stop miles away, he collapsed in the cab, his heart still racing. Moral Chris returned to the highway, but the memory of that night haunted him. No one believed his story when he tried to tell them about the gas station. But Chris knew what he'd seen. Sometimes, in the darkest corners of the world, there are places where the rules don't apply. Places where time gets twisted, and the people you encounter are not what they seem. The pit stop wasn't just a rest area. Class number 9. A True Horror Story. Introduction. Ali, Hamza, and Adil were the best of friends, bound by their shared curiosity and penchant for adventure. They studied in a prestigious school in their hometown, famous for its rich history and sprawling campus. However, their classroom, class number 9, had a sinister reputation. Years ago, a student named Farhan had mysteriously disappeared from the same classroom, and since then, eerie tales surrounded it. Whispers of a curse, shadowy figures, and unexplained noises plagued the room. Most students shrugged off the rumors, but Ali, Hamza, and Adil were different. Intrigued, they decided to delve into the truth, despite warnings from others. What began as a harmless investigation turned into a chilling ordeal that none of them could have anticipated. The beginning of the mystery. It all started on a cloudy Monday afternoon. The trio was in the school library, flipping through dusty books when Adil stumbled upon an old leather-bound diary tucked away on a forgotten shelf. The name Farhan was etched into its cover, sending a chill down their spines. "This can't be real," Adil muttered, his hands trembling as he opened the first page. The diary detailed Farhan's last days, mentioning strange events in class number 9. Whispers when no one was around, the feeling of being watched, and shadows that moved unnaturally. The final entry read, "If anyone finds this, remember, the truth lies beneath." Ali's eyes sparkled with excitement. "We have to investigate. This is our chance to uncover the truth." Adil hesitated, fear evident in his voice. "Are you serious? This sounds dangerous?" Hamza shrugged. "Dangerous or not, we can't just ignore it. What if there's a logical explanation? Let's check it out after school." The first signs. That evening, the school was eerily quiet as they sneaked into class number 9. The room looked ordinary at first, with rows of wooden desks and a dusty blackboard. But as they lingered, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered. The blackboard, which had been wiped clean, suddenly had the words "Leave now" scrawled across it in chalk. A cold draft swept through the room, making Adil shiver. "Maybe it's just a prank," Hamza said, though his voice betrayed his unease. "Or maybe it's a warning," Adil whispered. Ignoring their fears, Ali began searching the room. He knocked on the walls and floor, listening for hollow sounds. Finally, he discovered a loose floorboard near the teacher's desk. "Beneath," Ali muttered, remembering the diary's words. With some effort, they pried the board loose, revealing a trap door with an old rusty lock, unraveling the past. They returned the next day with tools to break the lock. Beneath the trap door, they found a hidden compartment containing an assortment of old items, a broken locket, faded sketches of students, and a crumpled note that read, "I was betrayed. They must pay." "This is getting creepy," Adil said, backing away. Ali picked up the locket and opened it. Inside was a photo of Farhan and another boy, both smiling. Maybe this was his friend, Ali speculated. Hamza frowned. Or his enemy. The diary mentioned betrayal. Before they could discuss further, a deep growl resonated through the room, and the temperature dropped sharply. "Did you hear that?" Adil's voice was barely a whisper. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, coalescing into a humanoid figure with glowing red eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure hissed. The haunting unleashed. The boys froze in terror as the figure loomed closer. It pointed at the locket in Ali's hand and said, "Destroy it or suffer." "What are you?" Ali asked, his voice trembling. "I am what remains of Farhan," the figure growled. "Bound to this room by the lies and betrayal of those I trusted." The figure's voice grew louder, filled with anguish. "Destroy the locket and free me, but beware. It will cost you." Adil panicked. Let's just leave. We shouldn't have messed with this. Ali shook his head. Number, we have to help him. If we don't, who knows what he might do? Hamza stepped forward. What cost are we talking about? Farhan's spirit didn't answer. Instead, it began to wail, sending objects flying across the room. The boys dodged as desks and chairs were hurled toward them. The sacrifice. Realizing they had no choice, Ali grabbed a rock and smashed the locket. The glass shattered, and a piercing scream echoed through the room. The spirit of Farhan began to dissolve, but not before whispering, "One must stay." What does that mean? Adil asked, panicking. The ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a dark abyss. A force pulled Hamza toward it. "Help me!" he screamed, clutching Ali's hand. Ali and Adil tried to pull him back, but the force was too strong. I think this is the cost," Hamza said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Go! Tell everyone what happened." "No! We'll save you!" Ali cried. "You can't," Hamza said. With a final smile, he let go. The aftermath. The next morning, class number 9 was sealed off. The school claimed it was due to structural damage, but Ali and Adil knew the truth. They never spoke of that night to anyone, but they kept Hamza's memory alive. Farhan's spirit was gone, and the haunting ceased, but the cost of their curiosity haunted them forever. Moral: curiosity can lead to the discovery of hidden truths, but some mysteries are better left unsolved. When venturing into the unknown, be prepared to face the consequences. Darkness of the Winter Night. A true horror story. Introduction. In a remote village nestled between snow-covered mountains, winters were long and brutal. Nights were darker than any shadow, and the howling wind carried whispers of an age-old legend. The winter shade. A malevolent spirit said to wander the forest, feeding on the fears of those who dared to cross its path. Hannah, a young woman visiting her grandmother, dismissed the tales as mere superstition. She had come to the village seeking solace after a traumatic loss, but the villagers' wary glances and whispered warnings stirred a curiosity she couldn't ignore. When an unexpected snowstorm trapped her in the village, Hannah decided to venture into the forest, determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. The story. The forest was a frozen labyrinth of skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. Armed with only a lantern and a journal she'd found in her grandmother's attic, Hannah pressed on. The journal belonged to her grandfather, who had disappeared decades ago, leaving behind cryptic entries about the winter shade. The entries described a chilling pattern. Those who went missing often reported strange dreams of being watched before their disappearance. One phrase was repeated throughout the journal. "The darkness knows." As the wind picked up, Hannah felt the first prick of unease. The shadows seemed to shift and twist in her periphery, and the crunch of her boots on the snow felt deafening in the silence. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to close in around her. Just as she was about to turn back, her lantern flickered, casting a dim light on a clearing ahead. At its center stood a cabin, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Inside, the air was heavy with decay. The walls were lined with faded photographs, all depicting villagers staring blankly at the camera. In the center of the room was a mirror covered with a thick cloth. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, Hannah removed the cloth, revealing a surface that seemed to ripple like water. The mirror did not reflect her. Instead, it showed the forest, but it was alive with movement. Shadows slithered between the trees, and a figure emerged. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed an icy blue. Hannah's breath hitched as the figure turned toward her. Suddenly, the cabin's door slammed shut, and the lantern extinguished. The room was plunged into complete darkness, save for the faint glow of the mirror. A voice echoed from all directions. "Why have you come?" Hannah clutched the journal, flipping to the last entry. To face the shade, one must embrace the truth it reveals. Climax. The mirror's surface began to ripple violently, pulling Hannah closer. She fought against the invisible force, but her resistance only seemed to strengthen its grip. As her hand grazed the surface, memories flooded her mind. Her parents' death, the guilt she carried, the loneliness she buried deep within. The shade emerged from the mirror, towering over her. Its voice was a whisper that pierced her very soul. You cannot escape the darkness within. But Hannah remembered her grandfather's words. Clutching the journal, she faced the shade. You feed on fear, she said, her voice trembling but firm. But I won't give you mine. The shade hesitated, its form flickering. The shadows around it began to dissolve as Hannah's resolve grew. She closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth of her memories, the love she shared with her parents, the strength she found in their loss. When she opened her eyes, the shade was gone. The cabin was silent, the mirror cracked and lifeless. Resolution. Hannah stumbled out of the forest as dawn broke, the first light of morning banishing the lingering darkness. The villagers found her at the edge of the woods, clutching her grandfather's journal. The legend of the winter shade was true, but Hannah's courage had broken its hold on the village. She returned to her grandmother's house, forever changed but stronger for facing her fears. Moral. The story teaches us that the greatest darkness often lies within ourselves. Only by confronting our fears and accepting our pain can we truly overcome them. Fear thrives in the shadows of denial, but courage brings light to even